All right, good evening, everyone. Today we're going to finish up the chapter on Congress, chapter 11, and we're going to start with something that is pissing me off today about Congress. And you could take your pick of days usually, or take a pick of topics of days, things usually that are pissing me off about Congress. But this in particular, the senators from West Virginia and Arizona uh, are both. Okay, let's talk about this first. Before we get into that, let me also get to the correct chapter. Let's see, table of contents, 11. We're going to do, let's see, congressional representation. Okay, that's not right. This is. Now, we're going to talk about representation and we're going to talk about the differences between how the House and Senate work. And we're going to talk about some of the other things that are in the chapter today. But the thing that I have to teach you about is that what I teach you is it's how Congress was taught to me. It's how Congress is taught at a vanilla level. It's how things should work. Okay, we talk about very pie in the sky things. Well, if something's wrong with policy, you'll just fix it. If something happens, then well, the government will just take care of it, or the presidency will just respond to it. Uh, the reality is often much different than that. For example, this current infrastructure bill and reconciliation package that is passing through Congress. The $3 trillion that was part of the initial reconciliation package. People call that a big number. They call that this horrible deficit driving thing. But what you have to remember is that was already a compromise. That $3 trillion is a lot of money, and it would have done a lot of good. But it was already a compromise from the almost 8 trillion that Bernie Sanders wanted in the first place. So start there. Work it down to we're at 1.75 trillion now, and there are two senators and a couple of House members that I don't even want to get into because they're the House side is much more united than the Senate side right now on the reconciliation. They're ready. The House is ready to move on 1.75 trillion, and the things that are in there are good. Universal pre-K, the child tax credit extended for 2 years, uh, expanding Medicaid for states that have not already expanded Medicaid. Uh, Universally good things. Okay, the things that are out are things like paid family leave. If you have a baby, for example, and you get paid government time off, that's out. Uh, Free community college for 2 years, that's out. Um, I think elder care is in, so that's good news. There are good things that are in it, but there are frustrating things that are out of it for very dumb reasons, and I'm going to get into that in a second. Uh, let's start with Joe Manchin and his problem. $500 million or $500 billion, $500 billion is currently slated to go towards climate projects. And whether you believe in climate change or not, it is a reality that the United States Congress is deeming, and the president is deeming essential to the national security of the country. It has been deemed a national security issue. In that spirit, they've attacked it with several policies that they hope will uh, help drive corporate responsibility to actually take care of the planet, and also uh, kind of carrot and stick it with if a company keeps emissions below a certain point, the government actually gives them money and rewards them for doing that. That was one method. Joe Manchin didn't like this. Joe Manchin didn't like that we were universally going to switch away from coal to electricity. Now, Joe Manchin doesn't like that for two reasons. First of all, West Virginia is overwhelming. It's the coal mining state of the United States. Coal mining only happens in West Virginia, or at least the bulk of it happens in West Virginia. I shouldn't say all of it. The other side of it is that Joe Manchin directly profits from the coal industry through his family ties. He has business leanings in coal. So that's a problem. Joe Manchin's got a problem. And Joe Manchin today pointed out that he wanted work requirements for paid family leave. Now, what the hell does Joe Manchin think paid family leave is? It is time off of your job that you're already working at so that you can take care of your newborn child. That's what paid family leave is. Or if you have a family emergency, you have paid time off. That doesn't affect the company. That doesn't affect their bottom line at all. It just affects what Joe Manchin thinks is a welfare state. And what I'm trying to say is Joe Manchin is an idiot. So let's go there, first of all. Joe Manchin also wants to know how the bill is being paid for. He wants to know he's hand wringing over the deficit. You know, $3 trillion over 10, and the bill is paid out over 10 years. It's not $3 trillion at once. It's 10 years. But Joe Manchin's hand wringing because he can't leave that on his grandchildren. While also universally saying that we cannot have a corporate tax to go back to 25%, where it was 30% during the Obama administration, dropped to 20% in the Trump administration, and we can't go back to 25 or 23. Because he's not getting answers on inflation and other things, because inflation has nothing to do with this particular bill. Inflation's already happening. That's from the supply chain. That's from COVID. That's from the Fed. That's a whole other issue that I'll admit that I don't totally understand, but it doesn't have anything to do with this bill. Not one thing. And Joe Manchin can't vote for it until he understands it. Okay. Kyrsten Sinema. One of the things that is also out of the bill now is, and this was in order to get her vote, by the way, the right for Medicare to negotiate drug prices with pharmaceutical companies. These policies, or that policy in particular, is overwhelmingly popular, with 70% of Americans believing that, understanding anyway, that if Medicare can negotiate drug prices, we're going to get lower drug prices on the other end of that. Now, I remember watching a documentary one time that a certain insurance company would actually pay their customers $500, give them a plane ticket, ask them to fly to San Diego, drive to Mexico, get their medicine, and come back. They'll pay for all that travel, give them $500, and still save money. That's how ridiculous drug prices are now. And Kyrsten Sinema is against that. Now, why is Kyrsten Sinema against that? I posted an article from the New York Times a few weeks ago, and I tried to get it non-paywalled, and I couldn't find it. So I'm sorry. But Kyrsten Sinema has been taking big money donations and going to fundraisers with, guess who? Big Pharma. She left the negotiations on Capitol Hill to go back to Arizona to fundraise. She left her job, which is to support the people of Arizona and the people of the United States, to go back to Arizona and be, as she calls it, a maverick. She wants to be John McCain so bad she can't stand it. and fundraised for herself. Now, in the meantime, you got right-wing groups that are supporting her candidacy, supporting her re-election campaign, and that's all part of the deal. As long as she strikes down certain things from inside of the bill, they'll give her all the money she wants. And I got problems with Kyrsten Sinema for a lot of other reasons. When you're a sitting member of Congress, when you're a public official like that, your only obligation is to your constituents and the press. And she's not answering questions for either one of them. She's living in her own little world. They're writing these little puff pieces in the New York Times and in the opinion pieces of the Hill. And her friends are talking about how she can't be bullied. She's her own woman and this, that, and the other. And she's just so it's bullshit. Bullshit. She's doing it for, I hesitate to say this because it's such a, it doesn't, she's doing it for attention. She needs to be loved. And have you ever read Machiavelli's The Prince? Is it better to be feared than loved? I say both. You must be feared to a certain degree, but also loved so that the people will support you. But they must also know that you mean business. If you never read Machiavelli's The Prince, you need to go read it. It's you might get it in one of your history classes. It's a very good book on political treatises. So in the meantime, I say all of that to say this. Passing legislation in Congress comes in two different forms. There are two different bills on the table right now. There's the infrastructure package. That is a regular run-of-the-mill bill. We're going to get 60 votes on that bill. It's got bipartisan support. These are all good things. It'll get the 60 votes that it needs to beat a filibuster. We'll probably end up talking about filibustering in an individual sense. I'll do just like a whole class on just the filibuster while we're doing the presidency. So don't worry about that yet. But there's also a process called reconciliation. Now, reconciliation is changes to the national budget. It can be done with a simple majority in both houses. Reconciliation is the way that the Democrats are deciding that they're going to go about getting their agenda done. You got a majority in both houses, but because of the filibuster, you still have to do things of reconciliation, and you have to jam all these things that are amazingly popular into a single bill. And that's the Republican knock on it, is that why are they doing so much at once? Well, it's because the system makes them have to. And nobody wants to budge on the filibuster because the fear, and what I was taught at West Georgia, and again, we're going to do this individually. What I was taught was the filibuster is the backstop to actually the idea that each time that power shifts inside of the Congress, the filibuster ensures that there's a relative sameness in the policy that is passed. It keeps things from flip-flopping back and forth. It makes legislation a little bit harder to pass. My thought is that it has a racist component that you really can't get past. You just can't get past it. So again, we'll talk about the filibuster individually another time. Now let's get into our text for today. Sorry I started off on that long diatribe, but it's pissing me off, and it's important that you know what's going on. I read a different article today as well. Hey, Ruska. Pitbull just came in. What was I about to say? Oh yeah, I was going to talk about the Gen Z. There's an article that came out that Gen Z is tired of the politics. And to a degree, that's true. They're tired of Democrats and Republicans because Gen Z really gave Democrats the majority in the House and the Senate. You elected them to majorities and they're squandering those majorities, trying to do the right thing, trying to be nice, trying to be popular, trying to, I don't know. I don't really know how to explain it. But they're being jerked around and they're mad and they have every right to be, in my opinion. As a professional, I can see why people will be upset. All right, so let's get into our text. Representation is, as the book says, a complex concept. When you're being represented, especially in the House, those members have to be very aware of what their constituency wants at any given time. In the Senate, you're not as worried about what your constituency thinks. You're trying to do what's best for the whole. But in the back of your mind, you have to be watching is what the makeup of your state, the ethnic makeup, the racial makeup, the gender makeup. All of those things matter. And it also matters to a degree when you're talking about those same principles, the same makeups of those people that are actually representing the constituency. You got to pay attention to, if you're a supremely Latino community, you're probably going to want a Latino to represent you. If you want to, if you're the national committee, you want to run and you want elected people that are going to most closely represent the communities that they actually are running in, as close as you can. I'm actually not going to get too much into this because I'm not going to ask you about the trustee model of representation or the Politico model. I'm not going to ask you about those things. I'm going to ask you something very bland about how important is it for representatives to reflect their communities, but that would be a very opinion-based answer. So let's get into congressional approval. Congressional approval sucks. And you know why it sucks? Because Congress sucks. And Congress has consistently sucked. For as long as things have sucked, Congress has sucked. They sucked before, they sucked after, they sucked the entire time that they existed, except for October of 2001 when they declared war on terror. Government shutdowns, which, by the way, we're looking at another one of those in December. Just, Merry Christmas, everybody. Happy Thanksgiving. But you got to come back to Washington and negotiate to keep the government open or not. With the debt ceiling. The debt ceiling is a whole other thing that I could get pissed about. But not today. The problem that Congress really has is that there is a disconnect between congressional spending and deficits and the deficits that we run in our own home. If, for example, we were to cut our costs, like if we were to turn the lights off and try to be careful about how much water we used or how much toilet paper we used, or if we were being more frugal about certain things, trying to get the electricity bill down, gas bill down, the water bill down, whatever the case is, Congress almost does exactly the opposite. They dream it and they do it. And then if they don't have the money to do it, they just borrow the money to do it, or they tax us a little bit higher to ensure that it's done. All these things, there's just, there's a, it's a winning strategy for Republicans to jump up and down and yell about deficit spending. It's a winning strategy for Republicans to fall all over themselves saying they're going to leave that debt to your children. They're going to leave that debt to your children. But there's actual legitimate economic studies saying a deficit is probably for the best. That especially during periods of economic decline, which is something that we've experienced a lot of in the last 2 decades since the new millennium. Like the last time that the actual budget was balanced and we had a net neutral deficit was during the Clinton administration, I think in '96. The argument is that when a government spends during a down economic time period, that it'll stimulate the economy. You're pumping money back into the economy that is redistributed back throughout the economy, and therefore pumps everybody up. This is then shifted into political speak where it's called waste, where it's called this, it's called that, it's called the other. The reality is that if you, the voter, don't like the policy that is being proposed, then you're more likely to either favor it or not favor it based on your own perception of it. Like if it's going to run a deficit, then you're not going to like it, period. If you already don't like it, and then you find out that there's not enough money to do it, then you're already not liking it, and then you're doubly not going to like it. Get it? So that's something that politicians prey on and hope that you don't read between the lines and try to actually learn about otherwise. And I'm not saying that you should take my word for it. Just, be aware that they're trying to manipulate you in that way when they start talking about deficits. Now, they don't necessarily dislike deficits. They just dislike deficits for the other party. Things that would look good for that party, that's what they dislike. They don't dislike the deficit itself. And that particular issue shapeshifts between, who's in office. I mean, it really just matters about who's in office, whether or not the thing is wasteful or not. Like the Republican tax bill in 2017, we knew that was going to run up a $10 trillion deficit over 10 years, and eventually it was going to raise individuals' taxes. We knew all of that was coming, but because it was a Republican bill, a lot of people in my area loved it because, well, this was a deep red territory. Tax cuts are good for me, right? They're good for me. He's standing up for my rights. He's going to get the government's hand out of my pocket without actually telling them that eventually middle class taxes will be raised, and the benefit of that tax cut would be at the top, 10% of business, and not actually at the middle class at all. Now, the Democratic strategy is to close loopholes and to actually tax businesses and get them to start paying their fair share of money, in which cases sometimes they haven't been paying any money at all. Now, again, you have to understand my bias there. I'm not a businessman. I'm just a professor, a very liberal professor. But my night job is a liberal professor. My day job is teaching you guys, just straight down the middle. And I'm sure that there's some kind of there are inherent risks with taxing corporations, and that's that corporations as a whole, they talk about all the time, if you raise our taxes, we're going to have to raise the price of goods. That's not necessarily true. They're having to raise the price of goods right now because there are things like the raw materials, because of the COVID and the supply chain issues that are happening across the world, not just out in the Los Angeles harbor, but the supply chain issues and the scarcity of natural resources and raw materials in particular. All those things play into why the price of bacon has gone up significantly, why chicken is sometimes hard to find. Which actually, there's a good story about chicken that I could tell you if you want to hear it. Just reach out privately. One of my friends works for one of the big chicken growers. But all of these things collectively, like even oil prices right now, oil prices are skyrocketing, and OPEC could do something about that today. They could, start producing a little more oil. They could, pump out a lot more oil, drop the demand a little bit, drop the gas prices. It's not, the Let's Go Brandon stuff about, it's the same. It's the same problem that happened with Obama. When gas prices went up, it was a supply issue. And they do that periodically. I mean, it happens periodically because they make a little short-term money. Although it is not that they can't produce more, it's not that they can't get the price back down. They don't want to. They just don't want to. It's not President Biden sitting in the Oval Office going, raise the gas prices. It's not about Donald Trump getting in the Oval Office and going, lower the gas prices. Lower it down to $2 for all Americans. We're going to make it free for everybody. It's going to be huge. It's going to be the greatest gas, the cleanest gas. You could eat this gas. You could drink this gas. It's so good. It's not like that. Presidents don't really have that much power over gas prices. Sorry to burst that bubble, but they don't. It's all about, God, what was the point of this whole thing? Oh, deficit spending, right. It's all about the politics of it. It's all about who's in office. And usually it's always more complicated than that picture on Facebook tells you it is. Okay, it's always more, I'm pretty safe in saying that it is universally always more complicated than your Uncle Dan and Facebook says it is. Almost every time, I promise. So let's talk about party leadership, and then we will talk about how legislation is made, and then we'll call it a day. And you'll have learned about Congress. Or you'll have learned what I want you to learn about Congress. Congress in both houses, in the House and the Senate, have leadership structures. In the House, it is the House Democratic Conference and the House Republican Conference. They meet regularly and separately, not only to elect leaders, but also to discuss important issues and strategies for moving policy forward. whoever holds the majority in the House, whoever controls that chamber, is the majority conference. Generally, now this is true for the Senate too, whoever controls the majority is the majority leader, whoever's in the minority is the minority leader. They lead their conference. And then you'll have independents that, like Bernie Sanders, who generally join one conference or the other, depending on their ideological affinity. Affinity, not infinity. Let's see. Now, in the House, there's a person called the Speaker. That she is the only, or this person is the only actual congressional officer mentioned inside of the Constitution. She or he is elected by the majority of the members. Usually it takes a certain number of the majority to actually elect the member to the Congress. Now, one thing is that the Speaker of the House is elected by the entire House. That person does not have to be an actual voted in member of the House. But to date, all 54 speakers have been members of the House already, which is why you hear rumblings about Donald Trump being elected Speaker and put back into the line of succession. That's how the Q people talk about, we're going to make him the Speaker, then we're going to impeach Biden and Harris, and then we're going to have Trump as president again. That's how they want to reinstall him. Or at least that's what it was a month ago. It could be something different now. Now, the Speaker is the presiding officer, the administrative head of the House, the partisan leader of the majority party in the House, and an elected representative of a single congressional district. This person is second in line behind the vice president to succeed the president in an emergency. And the Speaker will serve in that position until the majority party is either voted out of office or loses the majority in the House. The party does not vote her back into that position, or she chooses to step down. John Boehner, Republican John Boehner, stepped away from the podium when he thought his position was in danger. When you're the Speaker, one of the more important things that you do is count the votes. And you know the status of your party at any given time. You know the status of your position. You know how it works. So let's see. Speaker has a lot of power. The Speaker assigns bills to committees, decides when a bill is presented to the floor. Again, when I said the Speaker can count votes, Nancy Pelosi has a reputation for only bringing votes to the House floor that she knows will pass. She's not going to take a chance on embarrassing herself or the caucus by not passing legislation. If she brings it, it's going to pass. The Speaker rules on House procedures, delegating responsibilities to other members of the House. They appoint members and chairs to their committees, create select committees for a specific purpose, and can also select a member to be Speaker pro temp, who acts as Speaker in the Speaker's absence. When the Senate joins the House in a joint session, like the State of the Union, the Speaker presides over the sessions because they are normally held in the House of Representatives. Now, there are floor leaders that are elected at this point. Majority and minority leaders as well. The minority leader is visible but not always powerful, Kevin McCarthy. McCarthy's job is like Speaker, but just for the minority. He doesn't have the official, he can't bring legislation forward to the House floor. What he does his best to keep his party in order in terms of strategy and political decisions. All that stuff runs through McCarthy's office. And hopefully, when you hold the position of minority leader, you're hoping that one day you can whip your caucus into the majority and become Speaker. Now, the majority leader is not the Speaker. There's a second position for the majority leader, and generally it's believed that the majority leader, if the Speaker steps down for whatever reason, it's generally understood that the majority leader is the closest in line and should be elected to the post of Speaker in the absence of the Speaker's position, the Speaker's chair. There are two-party whips. The whips are exactly what you think they are. They whip the party into line to get them to vote the way of the party. They'll negotiate, they'll tear heads off. The whole idea of House of Cards is that Frank Underwood's character, or Kevin Spacey's character, is the majority whip. They are the enforcers of party discipline. They're the ones that deliver the bad news, generally. They do the carrot and stick approach. They will get members to vote the way of the party. The Senate, on the other side, also has majority and minority leaders, also whips. The Senate does not have a speaker. All the duties held by the speaker on the House side are held by the majority leader on the Senate side. The Senate's president, according to the Constitution, is actually the sitting vice president. Because the president of the Senate does not actually operate within inside of the Senate itself, the Constitution allows for the Senate to choose a president pro tempore, usually the most senior senator of the majority party. It's largely formal and mostly powerless. The majority leader holds 99% of the power. The majority leader, chief spokesman for the party, but unlike in the House, he or she does not run the floor alone because of the traditions of the unlimited debate and the filibuster. Now, I wanted to stress tradition of the filibuster. We'll talk about that individually. The majority and minority leaders often occupy the floor together in an attempt to keep things moving along. There are partisan actors inside of this process. I'm sure all of you are shocked. So Congress is then divided even further into committees. These committees deal with, let's say there are 20 standing committees in the House and 16 in the Senate. Each one of them subdivides an issue that the country deals with: agriculture, appropriations, armed services, budget, education, energy, ethics, financial services, foreign affairs, homeland security, House admin, foreign relations, intelligence, judiciary, natural resources, oversight and government reform, the rules committee in the House, judiciary in the Senate, science, space and technology, rules and administration in the Senate, small business, transportation, veterans affairs, and then ways and means. Each of the two chambers has different responsibilities that require different sets of committees. So those are there's a whole list on the in the textbook. You compete for positions on these committees, and the leaders of your party assign you committee assignments. All committees are chaired by the majority parties. All committees are also delegated almost as equally as possible amongst the representation in the in the total chamber itself. So if there's a majority of Democrats on the committees, going to have 11 Democrats, 10 Republicans, or some ratio close to that. And committees, in terms of the legislative process, have a lot of power. The chairs have the ability to stop legislation from being entertained at all. So during the committee process, if a committee votes down a bill, then that bill dies right there in committee and never reaches the full floor. I would say 80% of the time, this is what happens to most legislation. Let's see. Committees had the ability to subpoena in the House. They can hold hearings to collect information for bills. And in the Senate, as part of their confirmation power, they hold committee hearings for to gather information on the member that is trying to be confirmed to whatever cabinet post or whatever federal agency or judgeship that they're going to be confirmed to. So the appropriate committee handles that particular appointment. There are 4 different types of committees. The joint committees, standing committees are first. They're the permanent committees. Joint committees appointed from the House and the Senate. Conference committees are used to reconcile differences in bills, or in the same types of, like, if one bill passes the House and one bill passes the Senate, but they're both, it's the same bill in both sides, but they have minor differences in terms of amendments or in terms of some policy differences, they come to a conference committee, which is made up of both House and Senate members, and they iron out the differences until the bill is identical. The bill goes back into the main chamber to be voted on again. Once it's voted on again, then it goes to the president. But it's got to be identical before it goes to the president. Committee hearings, if you've watched the news at all, you've seen these ridiculous soundbite meetings that the Republicans had tried to make with Attorney General Garland last week. I should have sent you a supercut of the ridiculousness that happened in that committee about the school board stuff that just made no sense. I mean, talking about the sicking the FBI after parents, that's not what happened. And if you actually read the memo, you would know that it wasn't the Department of Justice that issued that memo. It was a separate entity that has nothing to do with the Department of Justice or government, for that matter. It was the School Board Association. But you know, when is a little fact ever worried about what's actually going on? When members of Congress are selected for their committees, their backgrounds are generally brought into play. So if you got a guy that was a judge, or if you got an individual that was at one point part of the legal system, they're going to do in the Judiciary Committee. If you've got a gentleman that was in the military or worked with the military for a long time, they might end up on the Armed Services Committee, or in some cases, the Intelligence Committee. It just all depends on what their background might be. And some of it depends on the member's choice as well. but that only really comes into play once you've been there a while, won re-election a few times, and gained a little seniority. Seniority absolutely counts in terms of committee assignment because, well, quite frankly, all the money's in Ways and Means and oversight, not in armed services. There's no lobbyists there. You want to go where the lobbyists are. If you're a politician, so that you can get those free dinners, the free gifts, all those things that interest groups provide as a lobbying firm. Those things happen during the committee process. Mm. Okay, hold on. I turned it sideways and now it's all funky. Okay, now the Senate holds, a senator will hold more committee assignments than a House member will because of the smaller membership of the Senate to the House. A House member will generally hold 2 committees at a time, whereas a Senate member can hold up to 5, I think. It just kind of depends on the senator and how willing they are to, or what their background is and where they want to work. I think senators have a little more latitude in that manner. Now, the last part is the legislative process. And the classic process is that a member, all right, so a member proposes a bill. Then the majority leadership talks to the parliamentarian about which committee to send it to. The parliamentarians are advisors, typically trained lawyers that understand the rules of the chamber. You are not obligated to follow the parliamentarian's advice, which is something that I'd love to beat Chuck Schumer over the head with about immigration and reconciliation. That's another thing. Parliamentarians are not elected officials. The majority leader can replace them anytime they want. So once the committee has been selected for the bill, the committee has the power, or the committee chair has the power to move the bill as he or she sees fit. Uh, Generally, at this point, it's either submitted to a subcommittee, which is a committee within the committee that deals with the individual thing, or deals with the full meeting of the committee itself. Either way, the bill will normally get a hearing or start going through the hearing process. Once we go through the hearing process, there is they can ask for expert opinions on the bill or certain aspects of the bill. Experts can be professors, can be people from inside the field, can be anybody that the committee deems necessary to the actual policy that's being passed. As long as it's relevant, it's okay. Once the hearings are done, the bill enters the markup stage. Amending and voting on the bill, adding things, taking things away. As soon as everything is or is not taken off of it, the bill is then sent to the committee for vote. If the committee decides to advance the bill, then the bill is advanced, and if they don't, it's called tabled, being tabled. Tabling the bill generally means the bill is dead, but it can be brought back up for a vote again at a later time. let's say, well, let's just use the books example that it goes to the House first. It's got to go through the House Committee on Rules. The Committee on Rules does not talk about the bill itself, but they set the rules for debate on the bill. Time limits, limits on the number and types of the amendments. After the rules are established, the bill moves through the floor where it is debated and amendments can be added. Once the limits of debate and amendments have been reached, the House holds a vote. Simple majority, 50 plus 1, 50% plus 1, which is 435. That's like 218, 219. It moves out of the House and into the Senate. Once in the Senate, the bill is placed on the calendar so that it can be debated. There's more flexibility to the House or to the Senate rules on debate than there is in the House. Senators will generally come down to an empty chamber and talk about whatever they want to. The thing that the C-SPAN cameras don't show you is that generally when somebody comes down to the podium and is actually squeaking in the well of the Senate, is that there's nobody else in there, except maybe one or two people that are waiting to squeak themselves. They do the squeaches so that they can make the local newsweek in their hometowns, and that's like most of the legislative process goes on in somewhere else, behind closed doors, in the committee process, in the hearing rooms. It just doesn't happen on the floor of the Senate, not like it used to. The filibuster, again, we're going to talk about the filibuster later. The filibuster is tradition. It's not something that is in law. It's not something that is in stone. It's something that's just been there a long time. Something that can be replaced fairly simply. But the ideological impact of that has become such that it will be hard to just do it. So we'll talk about that later. Also, reconciliation is free from the filibuster process, which is why that happens. So, both chambers go through an amendment process before the full chamber votes on it, which is again why the conference committees exist. So when the bill is ultimately passed through committee and passed through the full Senate and the full House, the bills often don't look the same. They got different amendments attached to them, they got different things attached to them. And then it goes to conference committee where those differences are ironed out. And in a perfect world, that's the end of the conversation. The bills go back. And change them as they need to until they get to an identical version of the bill. And then once that's passed, then the president can actually sign or veto it. We'll talk about the veto later, but that's the classic process. Um, now, the modern section of this chapter is not really. I kind of already kind of talked about it. the reconciliation bill changes the budget of the United States. Reagan used it to change economic policy. The filibuster used to be a talking filibuster. You used to have to hold the floor and not cede the floor for any reason. You had to talk the entire time you were on the floor. You couldn't eat, you couldn't drink, you couldn't start talking, you couldn't sit down. You had to keep talking. Then there are omnibus bills, which is, again, attaching everything into one bill and making it a straight up and down vote. The things you like, the things you don't like, the things you hate, the things you really hate, all the things on one bill. And what we're going to, like I said, we're going to talk about the filibuster in particular. So that's going to be the end of Congress. Let me know if you have any questions about Congress. Exam 2 is due. Please submit it as soon as possible. We're going to start tomorrow on my favorite chapter of the presidency. And then once I do the presidency, I'm going to tell you about exam 3 and the final. Because we're at the 1st of November and we're getting towards the end. And I'm either going to stretch it out or kind of eat. I might give you the final next week. It's not an exam like the other exams. It's different. So I might give it to you a little bit early, just to let you wrap your head around it, see if you have any questions. And we'll start with that pretty soon. Now, if you have not turned in exam 2, turn it in as soon as you can. I'm pretty sure that the Dropbox closes fairly soon. I can't remember exactly when. I'll have to check and see so that I can send an updated announcement. If you got any questions, just email me. And that's it for the day. Hope you guys have a good week. And I will see you tomorrow.